guys, welcome back to the Alpha Youth Aftershow. I'm your host Nolwandle and I'm joined by Maria and Charlie.
Yeah, we're so pleased you could join us here on the Aftershow, where we recap the Alpha Youth session of the week, and then we get to dive a little bit deeper into some of the topics discussed.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we get into it, let's watch a quick clip from this week's Alpha session.
Who do we think is the most famous person of all time?
LeBron James.
Taylor Swift.
Elon Musk.
If you're famous, what do you want to be known for?
Go full influencer mode. Dancing, maybe.
I think an actor. From the outside looking in, I had it all. But on the inside, I was like, man, I have never dealt with this type of pressure and fear.
My friends really don't care about what I'm wearing or how I look. They love me regardless of what I look like.
Whoa.
We can say that we're not in the rec room anymore.
Fake news sometimes have like a lot of explanation.
Let's see what ChatGPT says.
You have to pick what you believe, not just whatever you hear.
We are on the Sea of Galilee. A big storm blows up. Now, here is where the story gets interesting. See you later.
So guys, in this session, we got the opportunity to look at who Jesus is. And we got quite a few different ideas and answers in the session. And for me, one of the things that really stood out was the fact that at the beginning of the session, they described Jesus as a man from the Middle East. And they even say that he was a refugee. To me, that was so interesting. Like, I've never heard, or not never, but I rarely see Jesus described as a Middle Eastern refugee. I thought it was quite fascinating.
Yeah, I think it was also the first time I ever had heard of Jesus being called a refugee. That was quite an interesting perspective. But one of the views they had that really touched me is Jesus as a friend. You know, they called him non-judgmental. They spoke about how he wanted to be friends with the people who are on the outskirts of society, the lowest of lows. And he saw them, he acknowledged them, and he valued them where they were, you know? Yeah.
I loved how they called him a miracle worker. I mean, how cool is that? You know, he rose from the dead, he calmed storms, he even fed, was it 5,000 people with 2 fish and how many loaves was it?
5 loaves.
5 loaves,
a boys'
2
packed
fish.
lunch.
Boys packed lunch,
Yeah.
that's what Xenia said. I loved it. That was so funny. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was cool. Like, we heard different ideas. We heard, you know, Middle Eastern man, refugee. He was a friend. He was God, a miracle worker. And I'd be really interested to hear from you two. Like, we've heard all these ideas, but for you two, what's your personal favorite characteristic of Jesus?
Oh, that's a great question. Really good question. I think my personal favorite characteristic of Jesus would probably have to be his humility and his selflessness. You know, I think from the very beginning, you know, he modeled a humble life. He was born into a very modest family, you know, and he just dedicated his life to serving others, right? I think the most beautiful thing also is that he came to this earth not to show a way of living. He didn't just tell us how we should live life. He came down and he modeled a life completely submitted to God, you know, to show us what it's like. I thought that was amazing.
Yeah. I think for me it'd have to be boldness. Jesus was quite bold. Dan mentioned how his teachings were controversial and countercultural, and we see that those things constantly put his life in danger. But without fail, every time he showed up with the same boldness and said the same things and just did miraculous things. And some of the things he did, the way he lived, were actually prophesied about years and years before he even came into the picture. It's crazy. Yeah.
Actually, Nadi, you mentioned prophecies, which I think is a really interesting word, and I think we should get a little bit into it. So, Charlie, I remember you and I were talking about this the other day. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit more? Because I think you said something really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we were chatting about prophecy, and for me, prophecy is such a fascinating thing. Like, I don't know, in the movies and in the TV shows, prophecy is sometimes depicted as like this quite mysterious thing. It's almost like quite fortune-telling type vibes, or you're almost like predicting into the future. And sometimes these things happen and sometimes they don't. But throughout the Bible, prophecy is portrayed as a message from God conveyed to people through a person. And oftentimes it can be like an inspiration or a warning or an interpretation, and sometimes a prediction. And I guess like how this relates with Jesus is because over like hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus was even born, people wrote things down about this person that was to come. They wrote these prophecies down about this person who was to come and save people. And they wrote such specific things down about this guy. They wrote like where he would be born. They wrote how he would die. They wrote what he would do throughout his life, the miracles that he might perform, and the fact that he was going to come to save them. Yeah. And it's just mad, right? Like thinking about that hundreds of years before he was even born, these things are written, and then he comes and he fulfills them. I feel like, so if it was me, for example, or you, Maria, if 100 years before you were born, someone wrote something down, and then just before you were died, they were like, oh, I wrote this 100 years before you were born. And then you read this letter and it tells you all sorts of things about your life. It tells you where you were born. It tells you what you were going to do with your life. It tells you how you're going to die. It tells you all sorts of things. You might be a bit creeped out, but also you probably also would be like, where did you get this information from? Like, how did you know this 100 years before I was born? And it kind of makes me think, so it's kind of crazy, and it's really difficult to quantify. And I know like lots of statisticians, if that's a word, and mathematicians have tried to quantify the probability of Jesus fulfilling this, but it's tough.
It is. I actually remember you mentioning, I think it was a mathematician in the 50s. I think he analyzed 8 of Jesus's prophecies and actually found out that the probability of, anyone fulfilling any of these prophecies was, I think, 1 in a quadrillion, was it? Or
1 in 100
quadrillion.
Yeah.
I mean, what are the odds? Crazy.
Yeah, it's mad.
That is insane. Yeah. And it's beautiful to know that there are all these things that actually affirm that Jesus was who he said he was, that he's not just like a distant figure that's not relatable to us, but he's real, he's relatable, and he's actually deeply invested in all of us, right?
Yeah.
That is so crazy.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because historians don't really debate the fact whether or not Jesus existed. They kind of go, yeah, that man Jesus existed. But it makes me think about Mika's line, because she said something in the session 2 where she said Jesus was either kind of a delusional madman, a liar, or who he said he was, or God. And for me, like these prophecies and the fact that they got fulfilled and it all happened, it's just another piece of the puzzle for me of going, wow, perhaps Jesus is who he was claiming to be. Perhaps he is God.
Oh man, I've loved having this conversation with you and just hearing the different ways you've related to Jesus. And I hope you too have enjoyed this conversation. Please do let us know what stood out for you about the life and the character of Jesus by leaving a comment down below, just engaging with us on our socials. We are at Alpha Youth. We can't wait to see you next week. Bye.
See you
guys.
Bye.